I thought you could deal with this, James. You have to face certain realities. Anne's voice was a calm counterpoint to his anger. The laughing Randall in the background didn't help much. James tried to calm himself, thinking of chords. For some reason, the thought of playing chords on his guitar seemed to work. He took a deep breath before responding. I can deal with it, Mom. I just need a little more time. He tried to inject every ounce of sincerity into the words. With that final statement, the conversation effectively ended, save a snide comment from Randall that James ignored. He was allowed to leave and immediately proceeded to his room, which was at the top of the stairs a short way down the hall from the kitchen. He opened the door and peered in. It hadn't changed a bit from his memory. Everything was there, from the magazine basket filled with Mad and Air and Space magazine, to the bookshelf crammed with far too many cheap science fiction novels. The carpet was still the deep rust-red color, and the walls the white plaster. He briefly noted the small hole in the wall where he had put his fist through it in a fit of rage. It was covered over with plaster, but the indentation was still there. There was no guitar. He hadn't picked it up until after the Navy. The small window that looked out over the driveway was closed, but James could still see the ocean as he looked out over the bay. The house was higher than the rest of the city, since the city itself was laid out in a slope towards the ocean. The curve of the beach was visible, and it faded from sight as it turned north, curving up towards Santa Cruz. Unable to sustain interest in the sight, James moved over to a small chair that sat next to a wooden desk. It was old, his parents having found it at a garage sale somewhere, but it was a place to do schoolwork. He slumped in the chair and looked down at his hands. They were still the same slim hands he remembered from his childhood, but there was something wrong. It took him a moment to realize it, but the scar on the back of his right wrist was completely gone. In its place was new, hairless skin. Getting his braces removed didn't hurt as much as he remembered. Of course, the last time he had the procedure, his mouth had been a ravaged chunk of meat, with metals sticking into it at odd angles. The metal was still there, but the lack of injuries greatly lessened the inevitable discomfort. James ran his tongue over the teeth that sat solidly in their sockets. Apart from one tooth that jutted slightly on the lower left side of his mouth, his smile was nearly perfect. It looks nice, and commented as they left the orthodontist's office. Yeah, it feels a lot better without the wires in there. You're just so lucky. We thought you'd have to be in braces for at least the rest of college. He had been. James recalled that the only way he had gotten them off was to enlist. The Navy had not been too keen on a sailor wearing braces to basic. James spent the drive home thinking. The morning had already held some unpleasant surprises, not the least of which had been trying to find a pair of pants that fit. Almost every pair that he owned was now extremely tight in the upper portions. Although his height had not changed, the proportions of his lower extremities had. He had eventually given up and selected a pair of sweatpants, much to his mother's chagrin. The changes were indeed subtle. Looking in the mirror, James could still easily recognize his own face. It was the little ways that he had changed that were starting to bother him. His eyes, for example. It wasn't anything major, but the way they seemed to draw his gaze bothered him. He recalled an old class that he had taken in sculpture where they had attempted to recreate the eye of the statue of David. The depth of the eyes had been exaggerated in order to enhance the masculinity of the figure. Now, James realized that the structure of his eye sockets was changing in precisely the opposite direction. Where before he could press the heels of his hands into his eye sockets without applying pressure on the eyeballs themselves, now the slightest force brought the feeling of impact to them. His nose, too, had lost a slight amount of definition. Where before it had been a precise line from his forehead to slightly above his lips, it now was more of a curve. Combined with the forward progress of his eyes, it gave him a softer look to his rounded face. If anything, he was starting to look like the stereotype of a metrosexual man. When they returned to the house, James' first thought was of food. Although he had already eaten this morning, a ravenous desire was sweeping through him. He began to fantasize about steaks. No, not steaks, fajitas. Large ones. Bell peppers and onions. Maybe a side of refried beans with some guacamole-covered nachos to boot. He contented himself with a meatloaf sandwich, which was the fastest thing he could slap together in the kitchen. You're eating like someone with cravings, and noted when she saw James digging in the bottom of a pickle jar after downing his sandwich. It's not my fault. I'm just hungry. James, have you lost weight? Anne's question took shape as she stared at her son, her eyes roaming over his form. I don't think so. My jeans don't fit anymore. James replied through bites of a pickle slice. I don't think that has much to do with your weight, honey. Anne smiled at his response. Her face had a knowing look on it. Can I ask you something? Sure. James rinsed the empty jar in the sink, peeling the label off. He placed the now clean jar into the dishwasher, along with the plate that he had made the sandwich on. Have you noticed any major changes yet? And looked directly into James' face. No, not really. James lied. He rooted in the refrigerator, looking for something to fill the tiny empty spot that still remained in his stomach. He settled on a small strawberry yogurt. Well, I have. Her response to his omission did not give any hint of anger. She was treating him like the child that she thought he was. I think that you're going to be very beautiful, James. Huh? James ceased his search for a utensil as his mother's words made their impact. I don't really care about that, Mom. Right now I just want to get through this, and is there a spoon in this house? Try the dishwasher. I think you should think about it, James. It's not a bad thing to be pretty. Mom, look, the last thing I want to worry about is my looks. Opening the dishwasher, James found a spoon that didn't look too repulsive. He washed it off in the sink, using a small bit of dish soap. I've got enough problems with classes, and now this rush thing, and oh, by the way, have we figured out how we're going to explain that I'm a woman to the college? Yes. We're treating the forms they sent us as a mistake. I put the corrected ones in the mail this morning. Since you're already accepted, I just said that there was a typo on your original paperwork. And answered, leaning against a nearby counter. Typo? How the heck did you pass me off as a girl with a typo? Watch your language. I just went with your middle initial. I said that it should be M. James Fletcher instead of James M. Fletcher. Oh, wait. James paused, halfway through the small carton. What does the M stand for? In his own name, it stood for Michael, which was not exactly a girl's name. Margaret. And replied, rather blasé. It would have been your name if you'd been a girl. Margaret? You were actually going to name me Margaret. James groaned. Of all the names he could have been stuck with, Margaret was one of his least favorites. Don't talk with your mouth full. You can go with MJ if that makes you more comfortable. And offered, trying to come to some compromise. Oh, great. A little Scottish chick with the name of a professional basketball player. That'll go over real well. The sarcasm dripped from his voice. James. I'm trying to help you here. You can't go by your other name. And why not? Because no sorority is going to accept a woman named James. That's why not. I am not happy with you going off in this state as it is. I am not going to have you throw away your safety for your vanity. But Mom. James checked his voice. He was actually starting to sound like he was 16 again, right down to the speech pattern. He guessed it was true that you end up reflecting the expectations of others. No buts. You can either do what I say on this, or you can spend a year at MPC. That was a threat. James loathed the local community college, since the vast majority of the students there were nothing but slackers who had been attending classes since the early 80s. He had actually had to take several classes there during one of the periods when he was home. The thought of dealing with that again was hideous. Yes, Mom. James sighed in defeat. He finished the yogurt and tossed the empty carton into the trash. He started towards the front of the house. Where are you going? And asked, stopping him in his tracks. For a walk. He replied, beginning to move again. Be careful. I expect you home in 2 hours, young lady. What did you call me? James asked, whipping his attention back to his mother. I'm sorry, James. It's just that from behind. And explained, somewhat embarrassed. James ran his hand through his long hair and shrugged. He figured he might as well get used to it. He turned and walked to the front of the house. He left through the front door, started down the driveway. He noticed his mother's husband loading several items into the large tan truck in the front of the property. At James' approach, Randall turned and tossed off a slightly sarcastic greeting. Hey, Margaret. The voice of Randall brought a surge of anger to James. He moved past the working man, flipping him the finger as he did so. Not waiting for the response, James walked down the sidewalk in front of the house. The sidewalk was even, since the street he lived on was a cross street. He continued on for about a block, before turning to his left and crossing the street along the main boulevard. There were not as many cars on this road as there were deeper in town, but the road saw a fair amount of traffic. As he walked, James saw the city hall on his left and the city police department across from it on the right. The local fire department and library completed the rest of the block, setting the perfect small-town atmosphere. About a block after that was the main thoroughfare of Alvarado Street. James hurried on until he stood at the corner of the street. Alvarado Street was about 3 blocks of stores on a one-way avenue. Most of the shops catered to tourists, but occasionally there was something that a younger person could be interested in. Apart from that and a coffee and donut store, unless you were interested in trinkets, there wasn't much. He strolled along the sidewalks, noting the tourists snapping pictures of everyone and everything. Occasionally words in a foreign language would reach his ears, but for the most part, the conversations were recognizably American. Before he knew it, James had reached the end of the street. The convention center at the end of the street was not very interesting, and unless he really felt like smelling fish, there was no reason to walk down to the wharf. Besides, there was a very good chance that if he continued on, he might run into one of the local troublemakers. The Alvarado troublemakers were just bored kids, like he himself had been. This particular summer, he recalled that he had gotten into trouble by shoplifting along with the rest of them. That incident hadn't yet occurred, and if he had his way, James would not let it occur this time around. He turned and began to walk back up Alvarado Street. About halfway up, James spied the awning of Abenante's Music. The store had gone through many changes over the years, eventually selling out to a chain called Music Unlimited. For now, though, there it was. Looking through the large shop windows, he could see instruments of various types. Along one wall, set across from the counter, was a wall of guitars. James felt an almost overwhelming urge to go in. "I'm just looking," he told himself as he pushed the door open. A small bell on the opposite side of the door clanged softly as he pushed it open. "Can I help you, miss?" the stocky man on the other side of the counter asked. James brushed the hair out of his face and shot the clerk a withering look. "Sorry. Can I help you, sir?" the man asked again. "Yeah, I'm in the market for a guitar." "Oh, all right. Well, tell me if anything interests you," the clerk stated, staring at James. James knew that he was already being judged as a potential troublemaker.